So during this sprint review, I will be discussing the different user stories that we accomplished during sprint 1 and assessing their progress in terms of whether or not they meet the acceptance criteria that we have outlined. And then I will also be discussing our overall project progress as well as whether or not we completed our sprint goal. So for our user stories, the first user story was to set up the Salesforce website, and there were 3 acceptance criteria for this user story. The first was that there needed to be one login that every team member could use. So as you can see, we are all using Sean's login. And then the second part of this was simply to create this Campus Kitchen app. And as you can see, we are currently in that app right now, so it's been created. And the final part of this was to set up a schedule to make sure that each team member is only working on the app at one time, so we don't have multiple users making changes to it at different times, which could create errors with the system. And we have created that schedule on a separate website called Doodle. So we accomplished that user story and completed all of its acceptance criteria, so we said that that user story was done. The second user story was to create the database schema, and this also had 3 acceptance criteria associated with it. So if we go over to our schema builder, we can see that the first acceptance criteria has been met, as that was to create all of the different classes that existed in our DCD, and those different classes are all here: the donor class, the recovered food class, destination distributed food class, as well as our client interaction, and delivery route class. The second acceptance criteria for this user story was that the donor and destinations must be populated with the ID and name field and no other fields. As you can see, we have the ID name field, ID name, and we do have one other field here that is not a required field, and that's total pounds donated. And this is a roll-up summary that comes from the distributed food or the recovered food classes. This is not something they would have to edit or add. This is merely to help for reporting purposes, so they would not even be necessarily aware that this field is there. And so that was completed to our definition of done. And the final acceptance criteria here was that we wanted all of the relationships between classes to be built. So as you can see, we have a master detail relationship between donor and recovered food, as well as destination and distributed food, and then we replicated their existing lookup relationships between client and client interaction and client and delivery route. So we defined that user story as done, as all the acceptance criteria have been met. And as you can see, we are actually slightly ahead because we have also included attributes in most of the other classes as well, and the only class that we are still missing attributes in is client, and we're just waiting on some more information to finish those attributes, or to add those attributes. So we are actually slightly ahead on the database schema since we have attributes in more classes than we necessarily need to right now. As for our next user story, that was the manage donor user story, and the main acceptance criteria here were that you need to be able to create, update, or delete a food donor. So if we go to our donor tab, you'll be able to see that this class has been created, and they can add a new donor, and they simply have to enter the donor name, and they can also select an existing donor to edit or delete that donor, as you can see here. Now, the next piece of acceptance criteria was that this table should be populated with all of their existing donors, which we can see here. So that acceptance criteria was met. And then finally, we wanted to create user-friendly instructions on how to create, update, or delete a food donor using the Salesforce app. And these instructions are here, and as you can see, they include screenshots as well as text that explains how to go about completing those tasks. So that acceptance criteria was also met, and therefore all the acceptance criteria for this user story was met, and we can mark it off as completed. The next user story is very similar, and that was simply the managed destinations user story, and it had basically all the same acceptance criteria as the managed donors. You need to be able to add a new destination as well as update or delete an existing destination, which you can do by selecting one and then selecting delete or edit. So all of those acceptance criteria were met. The next acceptance criteria was that the food destination table needed to be populated with all their existing destinations, which you can see exist here. And then again, the final acceptance criteria was to have an instruction manual explaining how to go about adding, updating, or deleting those destinations. And as you can see, we have put that here, very similar to the last user story. So again, all of those acceptance criteria were met, and we defined that user story as complete. The final user story for this sprint was a non-functional user story, and that was simply to begin learning how to generate reports with filters in Salesforce, and then to compile that information into a document that all of the team members could access and understand. So the two acceptance criteria were it must have an easy to follow summation of how to create a report in Salesforce, and then also that it contain information about including filters and reports. So you can see here is our write-up of that research, and it includes information about reports as well as filters, and even went a bit further in terms of including some information about scheduling reports. So I would say that that user story is done according to the acceptance criteria, and actually went a little bit further than necessary by including this information about scheduling reports. So as you can see, we are right on track. We completed all of the user stories that we intended to for this sprint, and even went a little bit further by including some extra attributes in the database schema, as well as doing some additional research on reporting. So in terms of progress, we are ahead for this project. And finally, our overall sprint goal for this sprint was mainly to just make sure that we established good team dynamics during our sprints. We felt that this sprint technologically was going to be much easier than the future sprints. So we really wanted to focus on making sure we were building good communication and transparency habits during this sprint, so that when we got to the more technologically difficult sprints, we'd already set up a good foundation for having solid team dynamics that would make it possible to complete the sprints. And we feel that we did establish that foundation and therefore achieve that goal. So all in all, I'd say it's going well, and we are prepared for our next sprint. Thank you.